It was, of course, inevitable. As man explored his world, learned about his world, his ambitions took him ever higher. And wherever man went, conflict followed. The land gave rise to armies. Navies grew from the sea. And a half-century ago, the most powerful force in history took command of the air. It might be said that the United States Air Force sprang from whole cloth. But the threads of the cloth weren't blue. They were shades of brown.
In '47, it was an exciting place to go. The Army was the Army, the Navy was the Navy. The Air Force was something new and challenging, and it was not so rigidly organized and so on. So there was still scope for innovation and imagination.
The call for a separate and equal Air Force had been sounded for decades. To Billy Mitchell, it was all very clear.
Although the Air Force came about in 1947, there are some predecessor events that are very, very important. Certainly the agitation of Mitchell in the 1920s and some of the tremendous demonstrations that he did. Those had drawn a great deal of public attention and official attention to the potentiality of this new air arm, as had the combat experience in the First World War.
General Mitchell was the spokesman. In fact, he was court-martialed and convicted. Later, a few years later, the Congress saw fit to give him a Medal of Honor for his courage and for his advocacy of air power, which was such a key element in bringing victory in World War II.
People, power, and mission. From the earliest days of aviation, the people were daring and disciplined warriors. The power came from a constant wave of new technologies and the know-how to use it. And the mission was clear: win control of the skies and break the enemy below. Air power's central role in winning the Second World War was indisputable. With momentum and renewed passion, strong voices pushed hard for an independent Air Force. General Hap Arnold, Billy Mitchell's protege and commander of the wartime Army Air Forces, said it had to happen. The legendary Jimmy Doolittle made sure that it would. He helped organize the Air Force Association in 1946 to persuade Congress and the public.
We had all the enthusiasm, and we had a fervent belief that, just as General Arnold had said, it is important for the United States to maintain its air power, because the world is never going to be completely stable.
In the February issue of Air Force magazine in 1949, Jim Straubel, the executive director and also editor and publisher of the magazine, wrote an article, scathing article, on the case against the flat tops. Well, this caused a lot of raised eyebrows and a little bit of screaming here and there. And eventually a hearing was scheduled at the House Armed Services Committee. There were 11 admirals, I believe, who wanted to testify. It primarily it had to do with justification of the B-36. And the admirals were feeling that they were being read out of the picture and that their roles were being overlooked and that the monies that should have been going to some of the missions that they dearly believed in, or some of the weapon systems that they felt the Navy should have, was being on a boondoggle, they thought, on the B-36. This whole summer, spring and summer of 1949, revolved in what was more commonly known as the Revolt of the Admirals.
But the arguments in favor of an independent Air Force were more than the opponents could overcome. In 1947, President Truman signed the sweeping National Security Act that created the United States Air Force. Stuart Symington was appointed first Secretary of the Air Force.
We were gradually growing apart from the Army. We were something different from the Army. And we were very, very delighted when the Air Force was formed. And I think as a separate branch, the Air Force had the esprit that was necessary, really, to provide continued devotion to the concept of service in the air.
But the new Air Force was not the same invincible armada that had won World War II. After 1945, the strength of all the services was cut back. The Air Force was left with few pilots and fewer planes. After all, it was going to be a peaceful world. Just as air power changed the way wars were fought, technology was constantly changing air power. The new Air Force began to harness two explosive developments in aeronautics, the jet and the missile. General Bernard Schriever is considered the father of the Air Force ballistic missile program.
The German program did initiate our rocket program, but certainly not the ICBM program. The ICBM program came for a different reason. That is, that it was obvious that the Russians were, in fact, although we didn't have hard intelligence, were moving forward rapidly on an ICBM program, and this would upset the balance of strategic strength between the Soviet Union and the U.S. So that's what made the program so vital, and that's what really was the engine that started the ICBM program as such.
The first real test of the United States Air Force came in Korea. At first, the men and planes rushed to Korea were all World War II vintage. Political leaders had not anticipated this kind of war. With the North Koreans smashing southward down the peninsula, American response relied on whatever air power could be pulled together. Between 1950 and 1953, pilots, planes, and jet warfare came of age. With B-26s and B-29s raining bombs on the North's war-making capacity, and Air Force fighters furiously dogfighting the enemy in Mig Alley, air superiority in Korea was decisively achieved. Against the formidable Russian-made MiGs, Air Force F-86s had a kill ratio of 8 to 1.
Hang on. I haven't got him, but go ahead, take it, and I'll cover you. All right, I'm going in now. Okay, he's down, boy. You got him too.
The MiG-15 was so superior to any other airplane that we ever had there. So the only offset to that was a F-86. F-86, which was it was a Mach .9192 airplane, equivalent to the MiG-15. So that put us on par.
The threat of a shooting war between the Soviet Union and the West, and the near certainty it would become a nuclear Armageddon, framed American defense posture for nearly 5 decades. The Air Force responded to the Soviet threat with aviation technology that defined an era. The Century Series fighters rolled out in the 1950s, keeping the U.S. Air Force incrementally ahead of Soviet tactical aircraft. But the backbone of defense was America's commitment to meet a Soviet attack with massive nuclear retaliation. For the B-36s, the B-47s, and later the B-52s, this meant standing round-the-clock alert.
They knew they were on an extremely important assignment, and the alert force is one that can get off in a matter of a very, very short time. But they felt the importance of the job and the fact that they were appreciated, by their commanders, and I think the morale of the people who were part of actually, let's say, the missile fighting force had a great deal of pride in what they were doing.
Mark.
Intercontinental ballistic missiles became part of the arsenal. SAC created the first missile division, Titan and Atlas ICBMs that could deliver nuclear warheads deep into enemy territory within minutes.
There was no question about the threat of the ICBM. Even if it weren't used, it would be used for blackmail. So we had to get in there and get moving, and of course, within a year after we started the program, President Eisenhower himself gave it #1 priority of all defense programs in the Defense Department. It never was seen as a replacement for the bomber. It was to complement the bomber.
Despite the nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union as a sobering constant, American life in the 1950s was good. Everybody liked Ike. There was a certainty about America's place in the world, and that certainty reflected in the role of the Air Force. Air power did have its challenges at home. In towns and cities across the country, and particularly near Air Force bases, the roar of jet engines and increasing air traffic were causing short tempers and angry reactions from citizens. The Air Force Association responded by launching the Jet Age Conferences, fanning out across the country to explain the need for air power and the inconveniences that came with it. Throughout the 1950s, the Air Force continued to build its own unique identity. The one-time stepchild of the Army opened its own military academy in Colorado in 1955. It would be 40 years, however, before an Air Force Academy grad would become Chief of Staff. Pioneer aviatrix Jackie Cochran, piloting an F-86, broke the sound barrier. Benjamin O. Davis, leader of the famed Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, became the first African-American promoted to general officer in the Air Force. And the living symbol of American aviation, Charles Lindbergh, became an Air Force Reserve Brigadier General. Beyond fighters and bombers, another dimension of air power was coming to maturity. The spectacular success of the Berlin airlift in 1947 had proven that the Air Force's ability to move things was central to its mission. The aging fleet of C-47s gave way to larger and more powerful transports. Also making its first appearance in the 1950s was the soon-to-be workhorse of international airlift, the C-130 Hercules. To many, though, the lasting symbol of the Air Force's first decade is the strategic bomber, on alert, ever ready to unleash nuclear annihilation on a powerful enemy.
We have to remember that the Air Force leadership in the 1950s were basically individuals who had been tested in combat in the Second World War. As a result, they knew what worked. They knew, more importantly, perhaps, what didn't work. They had developed strong working partnerships and relationships. These were individuals who had very strong feelings about the use of air power. It did not mean that they all necessarily agreed with each other's views, but they all worked together to fulfill a common vision, and that was to make the United States Air Force the world's premier air service.
Ironically, it was the Soviet Union that proved the point Air Force leaders were trying to make. With the dramatic launch of Sputnik in 1957, it was clear that technology must advance on a broad front. As America rushed to catch up, 3 of the first 7 astronauts, Gordon Cooper, Gus Grissom, and Deke Slayton, were Air Force. Space was a new opportunity and a potential battleground.
We are a crisis-oriented country in many aspects. And that crisis occurred when they flew Sputnik. And from that time on, there was tremendous support for moving forward on space.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The Air Force was now well into its second decade, and in the coming years, its people, power, and mission would be tested in ways the aviation pioneers could not have imagined. If the mission in Vietnam was clouded by political constraints, the power was never in doubt. In all of World War II, 2,150 million tons of bombs were dropped. In Vietnam, the total tonnage was 3 times greater. 2,267 aircraft were lost, 2,118 Air Force people killed. But numbers don't tell the story. In Vietnam, as in World War II and Korea, the real story of air power was the story of the airmen. And the other heroes, dealt by fate a different hand, the prisoners of war, whose courage sustained them through long years of torture and confinement in the Hanoi Hilton. The stories of these heroes from America's most painful war reaches out across generations.
I feel a great deal of respect for these folks, whether they're a good pilot, an ace. It could be just someone that made it to Vietnam, made it through World War II, made it through World War I, and returned home safe. That's for the living. Of course, for the ones that didn't make it back, they get the ultimate amount of respect.
You want to do right by those guys, the people that have gone before you, the men and women that have flown before us and pioneered different aspects of aviation.
They asked us, they couldn't defend themselves, someone had to help, we responded. We may not have done the best job possible for a multitude of reasons, but we certainly had the capability of doing the job had we been unleashed. And what we did, I have not one iota of shame. I felt we did what we were there to do to the best of our ability.
In the wake of Vietnam, the Air Force faced new challenges in people, power, and mission.
The way that one conducted combat operations, the expectations that one had of an air campaign were critical. We learned again, and to our cost in many ways, that you cannot use air power to send a signal. You have to use air power to achieve decisive effect. If you are not trying to achieve decisive effect, you are wasting your time, and more than likely you're wasting somebody's life. It's that old joke, if you want to send a signal or if you want to send a message, call Western Union. The second lesson that Vietnam taught us was the importance of appropriate weapon acquisition, creating the right weapons for probable combat scenarios. We also learned something else. Training is critical, and we were simply not giving our fighter pilots the kind of training that they needed to go out and win 1v1 against an enemy fighter pilot.
Air Force power relied increasingly on new technologies. The first AWACS came into service, its sophisticated radars making command, control, and communication a fine art. At high speeds, new shapes and concepts had been evolving through the extraordinary flights of the X-15 and the record-setting SR-71 Blackbird. As new combat aircraft came into the inventory in the 1970s, they brought the technology and performance of a new generation. Dramatically different in design, the B-1 bomber and the F-15 Eagle joined the force not just as weapons platforms, but as flying computers. By the 1970s, the Earth was ringed with satellites. Air Force power had become aerospace power, with the dimension of space changing forever the basic mission to fly and to fight.
Space provides things that are inconceivable a generation or 2 generations ago. The ability to have global positioning satellites in space that enable us to position ourselves anywhere on the globe within tens of feet. You know, this is absolutely incredible.
As I go out and visit in Colorado Springs and I go out and visit the Space Command, there are young lieutenants and young captains out there sitting at terminals with controls that in many cases pilots would recognize. And there's no doubt in their mind that they're flying. They're flying satellites in space, and they are maneuvering them at their command to do things that need to be done and only can be done with human intervention.
Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In space, Air Force people were breaking new barriers. An all Air Force crew had gone to the moon. In 1975, Air Force Brigadier General Tom Stafford was among the astronauts who'd linked up in space with Soviet cosmonauts in the Apollo-Soyuz mission. Back on Earth, barriers of different types were falling. Fighter pilot Daniel Chappie James became the first African-American to make four-star rank. And at the Air Force Academy, the first female cadets were graduated.
I think that the early women in the Air Force, or ones who were just starting to come up in the ranks when I came in, probably had a lot more to overcome. Just mostly stereotypes. That the men they were working with that were their seniors had never had women in that position, and of course they were skeptical, well, a woman's never done this, how can she do this? And I think for the most part that the men were impressed. Whether they admitted it or not is another story, but I think there are some very, very capable and, I don't know, just amazing women out there.
Although there were a number of peaceful overtures between the East and the West, the Soviet military threat continued unabated. Within the United States Air Force, there was a growing concern. With the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, America's defense priorities returned to center stage. In the Air Force, many long-delayed programs moved rapidly ahead, and some were resurrected. Air Force people, power, and mission were moving rapidly by the mid-1980s, but there had been no substantial demonstration of air power for nearly 15 years. In 1979, the botched rescue attempt in the Iranian desert had involved Air Force support. Public attitudes toward military operations remained skeptical. But terrorism had become a major threat to national security, and helping fight it had become part of the Air Force mission. In 1986, terrorism was traced back to the Libyan desert.
A bomb went off in a disco in Berlin, killing American servicemen, and our intelligence told us that the perpetrators were traced right back to Tripoli. This was an opportunity for America to take action, firm resolve to show terrorists that they cannot run, they cannot hide. And it was a watershed event because we did it from thousands of miles away. It was the genesis, really, of global reach and global power as we know it today.
Life in the Air Force was good. The Cold War was still a fact of life. So too was the nation's commitment to have the best Air Force in the world.
We've certainly seen new technology. We've certainly seen continued growth in higher, faster, farther, the technical aspects that everyone sees. You see that when you go to fly American, United, and Delta. But much more important, I think, for the application of military power in air and space is the thinking that young men and women are now doing, which is much deeper than when I was a young lieutenant.
One indicator of the times was membership in the Air Force Association, which in the mid-'80s surged well above the post-World War II high. But it was research and development, often classified and conducted far from view, that was helping the new Air Force take shape.
Well, I think the Air Force is more about how people think about using the available space to conduct military operations than it is about hardware and equipment. And I think what makes Air Forces unique, airmen unique, is how they think and how they are not stuck with just the geography on the ground.
As the Soviet Union crumbled from within, the tension between the superpowers lessened. In an event unthinkable just a few years before, Russian MiG-29s landed and refueled at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. As the Air Force was entering its 5th decade, its people continued to be its greatest asset. Major Ellison Onizuka was lost in the Space Shuttle Challenger tragedy. But Air Force astronauts continued to push back the frontiers of space. Major Mark Lee released the Magellan probe from the shuttle Atlantis.
Will you join me in a toast to a magnificent American?
And in a loving look back, the grand old man of air power, Jimmy Doolittle, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
A man whose name will be remembered as long as the virtues of valor and patriotism last. Jimmy Doolittle.
As the 1990s dawned, the world was changing rapidly, and so was the Air Force. Looking Glass, for 30 years the round-the-clock airborne control center in event of a nuclear war, came in for a final landing.
Well, for months.
Air Force One, the flying symbol of the presidency, was now a new 747. Test pilots were flying concepts for the future, like the X-31. While the Air Force was deciding that its next generation of fighters would be the Lockheed F-22. Recognizing that future conflicts could take any shape, the Air Force established a Special Operations Command. Then, in July of 1990, Iraq invaded a tiny neighbor.
The singleness of the Air Force is very important so that you can bring to bear whatever is needed on whatever the situation is, and not be selective and have to go out and recruit a specialized Air Force to do a specialized job. You use the whole continuum and you use it as need be, and we saw that done in the desert in 1991. We probably didn't even know it was happening, but now in retrospect we find out we were really employing air power as it's supposed to be.
The world saw it in Desert Storm, what it means to have a highly technical Air Force that's capable of really acting with great precision.
In the aftermath of Desert Storm, the Air Force began to redesign itself for the future. The people, power, and mission would be structured in new ways. The venerable strategic, tactical, and military airlift commands passed into history. In their place rose the Air Combat Command and the Air Mobility Command. The Logistics and Systems Commands merged into the Air Force Materiel Command. Increasingly, the Air Force turns to its airlift capability to meet new contingencies. The C-17 came along just in time. The Air Force has fought beside allies from its earliest days. But highly political coalitions, like the NATO effort to stabilize Bosnia, require airmen and women to meet challenges of a complex and changing world.
Today, the men and women who are pilots get tremendous training and have, I think, just staggering capability.